2.
Morning, Kent. Here we are again with the next episode of our podcast today. It's good to see you. How are things out in Albuquerque today?
Things are very, very good in Albuquerque, Dave. Thank you. Good to see you. And I've really been looking forward to this session because, as you recall, on our first session, we kind of introduced our viewers and listeners to the concept of a medical industrial complex. And
Right.
you did a very nice job of laying out what that actually is about and what it consists of. And we are now at a stage where I think I would like to hear your thoughts about what's going on in one segment of that complex, and that's the senior care, the nursing home industry, because that has become quite an industry in its own right, and not for good reasons and not in a good way.
Yes, you're right, Kent. And of course, the title of our podcast is Fighting the Medical Industrial Complex.
Right.
And our tagline is fighting the medical industrial complex for the people, the American taxpayers who fund this medical industrial complex, which, as we've laid out in our first session, is hospitals and clinics and everything related to our healthcare in this country, which is about 20% of our economy. I mean, it's mushroomed over the last few decades to where it really is the most important part of the US economy today. And it's also a growing segment. And we said, as we ended our last podcast, laying out the pharmaceutical, medical device manufacturers, we said there was one area that we wanted to focus on first, and we'll get to these other areas. Namely, we're talking about, quote, nursing home, the nursing home segment of the medical industrial complex.
Yes.
And I think it's interesting. I don't know what your thoughts are. And you and I deal a lot with people having a relative in one of these facilities. That's what they are. They're institutions. They're not homes. And people in them are not residents. They are patients. They're sick people. They need medical care. And we know, and a lot of our friends, relatives, and we get contacted by folks wanting us to help them navigate these facilities for them because things are not really going well for them. But I don't know what you think, but most people are horrified at the thought of ever being in one of these facilities.
Well, there are, Dave, and there's a very insidious, it seems to me, I call it insidious, pipeline for how people get entrapped in these facilities. They're not going there for the most part voluntarily. They're not saying, I'm at a stage in my life where I think I need to have assistance with my day-to-day needs, and so I'm going to go move into a nursing home facility. That's not what happens. The pipeline seems to be when they fall and break a hip or have some sort of a physical situation that requires therapy, where they have to get exercise and special assistance to heal up from whatever happened. And that's the trap. Once they're in there, often they don't get that therapy at all. They really don't. They end up just laying in a bed and being put on meds to keep them quiet. And I'm painting a pretty ugly picture here, but I know of too many instances where this is exactly what happened. Somebody got put in there supposedly for a brief period of time, and if they have the financial resources that can be milked down available to the property, that's exactly what takes place. And then interestingly, when those funds are exhausted, they're booted out. They're literally booted out without making any arrangements for where they go next. It's a nightmare. And so I didn't ever realize that this is how this was, how the machine worked, so to speak, but that's what's going on. Now, I know you want to share with us how this has become a financial empire. And so right now we're talking about the clinical side of it, which is certainly part and parcel to what's going on, because you've got to have the population. You've got to have a way of getting these, you call them patients, I'm going to call them bed occupants. There has to be a way to pipeline these people in there to get access to the funds that the industry is enjoying in their business model right now. And that's one example of how it happens.
Well, you're right. It's ugly. Let's not pull our punches here. This is not an industry, and I don't care if you call yourself a nonprofit or a for-profit. It's an industry. These are corporations that receive federal funds, state funds under Medicaid and Medicare to provide medical services to patients who cannot live at home without round-the-clock medical care, theoretically. And we need at some point to look at how many patients are in these facilities who really could be at home. So we have that issue too, because we don't have enough home health care. But let's look at this industry, and I think that's what we're talking about. We're not looking at just the clinical medical side, as you said. We're looking at the financial side. And I think we have to do that. I think that's a side that's been neglected and ignored over the years by various organizations that are claiming to represent the elderly or the disabled in this country. Because this industry is a little like the fossil fuel industry, the tobacco industry. I put them in kind of the same category. They're a scurrilous industry. And let's be very clear about that. This is not a do-good, helping kind of a service for Americans, even though that's the way it's funded. But what I want to talk about, and I guess I call it the 800-pound gorillas in the room, or the elephants in the room that we tend to ignore when we talk about the nursing home industry. And one is, this is a real estate industry and a finance industry every bit as much as it is a medical industry, a medical care industry. And what we want to talk about today, Kent, and discuss is, well, what do we mean when we say it's a real estate industry? There are 15,000 buildings. Those are places we call the nursing homes in the United States. The average number of beds there's 109 beds per facility. I've calculated the value of that real estate to be somewhere around $250 billion, $250 billion. I base that on what a bed is selling for today, if you were to sell your facility, and the number of facilities and the number of beds. Now that's a rather rough estimate. Okay, $250 billion. Now we can throw out these numbers and it really doesn't mean anything to people. I mean, so 250 billion compared to what? Well, let's look at what that means. It means that you have, as a corporation, a commercial real estate venture on that will bring in revenue that's guaranteed. In other words, Medicare and Medicaid will pay you. Like you said, once you're self-pay, you've paid out of your own pocket and you have no assets left, you have to apply for Medicaid or Medicare. Well, then the government is reimbursing operators, and that's where most of their revenue comes from. Very, very little of the revenue, overall revenue of this industry comes from private pay. There are some, but it doesn't take long for a person to really exhaust their assets. So what we have is a lot of cash flowing, and I call it cash, it's capital flowing from the taxpayers. Now we think of the reimbursement for a bed. Let's say it's in a typical state, we're going to see $200, $300 per bed for Medicaid, and maybe $400, $500 for Medicare. Medicare pays more. So obviously these facilities want Medicare patients. And as you said, once you're private pay, you've exhausted your assets, they may not want you in their facilities and say, we don't take Medicaid, you're not on Medicare, which gives you 30 days for rehab after you leave a hospital, but you need Medicaid because you're going to be here a long time, and you don't have the assets to pay for that. So you have to plead poverty. And so they don't want you. There are a lot of facilities who don't take Medicaid patients because they don't think it pays them enough. But most of the corporations in this business do thrive off of Medicaid, off of poverty medicine, and they're making plenty to do this, although they claim they're not.
A sidebar here, Dave, on Medicaid. I've recently learned that the application process to qualify for Medicaid is really, really difficult. And the people who are the ones that need it are not capable of sitting down with the documentation and organizing it and basically completing their own application. They have to have assistance. And go ahead.
Yeah, I think we can get into that. You know, what does it mean to be a welfare patient? You have many middle-class people who've never thought they would ever be a welfare patient, but that's mostly what care in this business is.
Yes.
So they've got that money, but let's look at what that money supports. It supports an underlying real estate business. As I said, about $250 billion worth of real estate. Now, you would think, well, okay, they get the reimbursement, but they're getting far more from the taxpayers than just what Medicare and Medicaid will pay them, because real estate is one of the most favored industries according in the tax codes of the United States. For a lot of reasons. Number one, they have a very powerful lobby. We can go back in history and talk about the other factors, but we don't need to do that right now. But let's just say that the goodies that the operators or the corporations in this business get from the government are hidden, but it is goodies. It is when you can say, when you can write down your taxes, your corporate taxes, because you can take depreciation on your building. When you can write down your taxes because you can take interest as a tax deduction. You can take your CEO pay as a tax deduction. That is money that's coming from the taxpayers. That was money you owed the government, but the government says, we're not going to make you pay that. So we're going to forego that income to the US Treasury. We're going to let you keep that money. Well, what do they do with that money? Well, they make more money because it's interest-free money. There is huge amounts of that flows through this system that we can't really estimate at this time, because another thing the government allows this industry to do is hide their finances. Now, there are very large, the biggest players are listed on the New York Stock Exchange. So we can see what their finances are. So we have about 14 or 15 of the thousands of corporations involved in this business that control probably about 20% of the business, that we can look at their finances because they have to report those to the government, the Securities and Exchange Commission. That's the law because they're selling stock. They're listed on a stock exchange, so they sell stock to raise capital. And they have a lot of capital. But what we can't see are what we call closely held corporations. What are they, how much are they earning, let's say, based on the money that they're able to keep and not give to the government? That's why we call it tax expenditures. When you say to a nursing home corporation, you can keep this money because you're taking a depreciation allowance, then they have money in their pocket they can use to pay down their debt. That's basically what we're seeing here. So they're borrowed money anyway. They don't use their own equity to buy a facility. They borrow money, and their government goodies in the tax codes actually makes them money off of the money they borrow.
Yeah.
Okay. So we need to get that out and clarify it. So that's really coming from the taxpayers.
Right.
Right. And now, sure, at the end of of the life of that building, and they're flipping buildings, by the way. That's part of how they make their money, is they sell buildings back and forth, or they sell the building and lease it back.
At the point that the depreciation table zeroes out, basically, right?
Yeah. At the point where it's no longer advantageous under the tax code.
Right.
They will then sell the building. And there's plenty of buyers because another large corporation, usually a real estate investment trust or a big private for-profit corporation, has already sold this building and they need another building, so they'll buy another building. So they're constantly buying and selling buildings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a nice business model. Everybody should get in on that, huh?
It is. So here, now, I might have glazed some eyes over on this explanation, but here's why that's important. This industry is able to keep those lurid conditions going in these buildings, the abuse and neglect that's pervasive and widespread. They're able to keep that going through a propaganda apparatus. That is their American Healthcare Association, which is their lobby, their industry lobby. They have a really highly sophisticated propaganda operation. And they say, well, we can't afford to do better because we're just not getting enough money through Medicare and Medicaid. We're just barely making it. What they're not showing the public is all of the capital flowing into them from the tax codes.
Right.
And also, they've not provided any evidence at all that the Medicare and Medicaid funding that they're getting is not making them a very robust net income, or let's say a very robust cash flow, a very robust earnings on their investment. They've never proven that. They've never shown it. When I look at publicly listed companies, what I'm seeing is about a 7.5% net, at least, with about a 15% EBITDA, which we call earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, which is really what cash flow is about, right? So they've never really had to show the American public, because no one's challenged them on their argument that we're just not making enough money. Therefore, we can't have a better type of care for the people in our facilities. And you can't overlook that propaganda machine that they have. They have, the HCA has $30 million a year in revenue. They buy the best PR firms in Washington, D.C. They know how to frame issues. They have a narrative. We're not making money. If they would just pay us more money, we would do better for you.
Exactly, and they've been very successful too at the most common complaint you hear from someone who is in working with them or has a family member in there is that they're understaffed, and they are understaffed. However, they can turn around and say, our staffing is, while it might be less than ideal, we are in compliance with the laws and regulations for what staffing needs to be. Well, that's a real terrible situation in its own right, because they played a role in getting those staffing levels, acceptable staffing levels, set so low in their lobbying and so forth. So it all plays out very well if you're them.
That's right. And so here's the big gorilla in the room I keep pointing out to people. This is political.
Yes.
If you're a professional advocate, you're a lawyer who works for an advocacy organization, or you work for some nonprofit, and you're testifying before Congress, you're going to pull your punches. You're not, well, I'm not even sure if the people are pulling their punches. They're just not seeing the truth. And the truth is, this industry that you're testifying about, not necessarily against, but about the pervasive neglect and abuse that goes on in their facilities, they're giving Nancy Pelosi $10,000 a year just for her campaign, for her PAC. They're giving all of the top Democratic leaders. They're giving Republicans. Therefore, we have now such a corrupt system of government, and we have to say what it is, that Congress is not going to put pressure on the industry to tell us the truth, to open up their books, to let us see what they're making, right?
Right.
They're not going to do that. On the other hand, if a government agency that's supposed to be regulating them begins to put pressure on them to do it, they can bring political pressure down on that government agency. So the government agencies really do more to protect the industry. And I can give you examples of that. Let me give you one example. I want to call a state and I say to the agency that's regulating the industry, I would like to look at what this nursing home chain is paying its own facilities, its own LLC that it's leasing this facility from, what they're paying per square foot compared to what commercial real estate's going for. And they said, well, file a Freedom of Information Act. Well, they may or may, you can file, why should I do that in the first place? I'm a taxpayer. I want to know if we are getting a fair deal for what we're paying for.
Right.
In other words, so if you've got a little town out in some rural state and there's a nursing home out there owned by a chain, what are they paying themselves for that real estate?
Right.
Well, the state agency says, well, file a CORA or a FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act, and we'll get back to you on that. So I did that. So what did they come back and say, well, we can show you that, but it's going to cost you $700 because we're going to have to do a lot of photocopying. Well, that's not true. And so they stonewall us, Kent.
Yeah.
So that tells me what we have is agency capture, that the industry now has the political power to dominate the agencies that are supposed to be regulating them.
Yeah. Yeah. So
and that's a fact
in essence,
to talk about.
To put some plain numbers on this, in a rural community where a house that comes on the market might sell for $45,000, the nursing home owner is on the books, maybe paying a $30 per square foot rate on their lease for that home. And that's a huge incongruity when you think about it. They're paying big city prime rates for square footage in a market that is a very, very low value market to start with.
My guess is even in an urban market, they're paying more than what the market rate is for that real estate because there's no regulation on them. There's nobody controlling that because we can't get the information that we need. And here's another thing. If you want to look at the history of a piece of property in most states, you want to know how often this property has been sold, for what amount. You want to know the history of transfers of deeds, let's say, on a piece of property.
Right. Here's
what you will be told. I know because I experienced this. It's against the law for the assessor to tell you that is confidential information. The real estate industry was able to get that into law, that you as a citizen can't find out how over time that real estate has changed hands. And you know, we could talk all day about the reason it's important for us to know this, but particularly those of us who study the real estate aspects of nursing homes, we need to know that. We want to know how this property is being passed around. And we want to know how the sale and leaseback operations are working. I'm looking at a bankruptcy right now up in Iowa where we had a chain of about 5 owned by a couple. And they're declaring bankruptcy. Well, is it because this couple sold these facilities and then leased them back, pocketed the money for selling the facilities, and then just let the facilities run into the ground because they looted them? They just pocketed all the money. So we got to know this, and we have a right to know this as citizens, but we're getting a lot of veils of secrecy out there. We're getting stonewalled out there by these agencies. And therefore, we have to fight at the legislative level with one hand tied behind our back. Actually, both hands, because if they untie one, we still aren't giving the money to these legislators that the industry is giving them. And it's Republicans and Democrats. It's both sides of the political.
It's definitely a bipartisan issue in that regard. It certainly is. Yes.
And unless we start talking about that and we start calling out our legislators, then we are not going to be able to be an effective fighting force against the medical industrial complex. And I think that's where we go from here, Kent, now, is hopefully today, the discussion of real estate, of some of the more technical aspects have not been boring, but it is important. And we can clarify those, hopefully in a very interesting way as we go down the road. But I think from this segment of of this podcast that we're doing, I think we're focusing in on, hey, don't think that the money is only coming from Medicare and Medicaid. And one other thing I hope we can talk about as we go down the road is these facilities operate in a restricted market. They operate in it with a guaranteed revenue, which puts a lot of value on real estate.
Yes.
That facility has a license. There's only so many of those to go around. So that is an intangible asset that's never shown up on the balance sheets of these corporations. Okay, they don't invest in research and development. There's no innovation in care. Okay,
right.
Like you would in, say, a chip manufacturer or a tech company. They're gonna have money for R&D. We don't have these facilities haven't innovated in care at all in the last 70 years. You also have a certificate of need, which says only so many of these facilities can be in the market. So this is a restricted market.
Right.
Which guarantees a level of revenue without competition for these corporations.
Yeah.
We need to talk about that from an economic viewpoint.
Right. Right. So we have a lot of dots to connect here, Dave. Essentially, it starts with the fact that there is a below the radar transfer of wealth from the average American citizen after they've spent their life accumulating that wealth, whatever level it's at, and it's transferring into these vehicles, so to speak, that are really prospering for a very small number of people. And the mechanisms and the path for how that happens is intentionally opaque and very complicated. And then it's also supported by another reality. I'm not aware of any grassroots level association or organization. For example, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. Okay, that's a grassroots level association that has built up a lot of lobbying strength in a lot of important ways. Well, I would think it would be very important and beneficial for there to be such a citizens organization to combat abuse by this industry, because the abuse level it's scary. If you happen to know anybody who's gone through it, it's frightening, and they're not it's not being paid attention to because there isn't anybody shining a bright light on it, and we can help with that. We can do our best to help with that. I'd love to see a grassroots organization emerge to communicate to legislative bodies that you people have neglected this situation long enough. It's time that it be disclosed and rectified.
Kent, you brought up an excellent point. Transfer of wealth. The bottom 90%, maybe more, of Americans are being abused and neglected in their senior care in skilled nursing homes and paying for it and transferring their assets to the upper 1%, to a Wall Street group, because Wall Street very heavily invested. And investors in this business are extremely wealthy. So we're transferring wealth, and I'm glad you brought that up, and we need to talk about that. We need to talk about who are the real owners
Right,
of the big chains, and
exactly,
who are they, and how much money, and we'll do that as we go down the road.
exactly.
And how do they keep their money out of the US Treasury?
Uh-huh, yeah,
In other words, how do they keep their capital gains out of the hands of our government, which they owe? I mean, we won't take all their money, but they need to pay their fair share, and they're not. And we can talk about that as we go on, because we know the story there.
well, and another thing we might want to explore, as you said, there's a very tight system that keeps competition from emerging. But even the companies that are in a position perhaps where they could buy that certificate of need that they want to open up a new facility, are they doing that? Because if you look at the American population's rate of aging and future need for these kinds of services and how fast that's growing, are new facilities coming into the pipeline to match that level of increased need? And I think we both know the answer to that. No, they're not.
Right, we're retrofitting old buildings
Yeah,
for people with dementia, which really aren't suitable, and we'll be talking about that. So I think we've gone down the road a ways on this today, and what we've talked about, as you put it, how there's a stream of revenue, of capital flowing into this that's sort of a hidden river.
mhm. Good term.
And as the industry propagandizes about how it's going through hardships financially, which it isn't, they're keeping this river of capital secret from the
Yes,
public
yes,
and lying about it. It's a lie. Propaganda is a lie,
right.
and they're good at it. And we'll be exposing that. So I'm looking forward to our next session where we can elaborate more on exactly how this industry propaganda network operates. I think people
Absolutely.
will be surprised. And I think they'll be surprised at how the mainstream media plays into that and is roped into that. Even well-meaning journalists, and there are many, who write the horror stories, fail
Yes,
to expose the context
exactly.
in which this is happening. So we think, well, we have some bad apples out there. No, it's not a bad apple. It's a structure of this industry.
It's a bad system all the way through. Exactly.
And yes, and that's what we're going to clarify here. This is
Yes.
what we're going to bring out and
Right.
give people the ammunition to go to their legislators and say, quit lying to us. Don't buy into these lies, because you got these lobbyists here paying you a lot of money to go along with what they're saying.
Mhm, exactly. Dave, this is a good point to put a pin in it. I think we've covered some really important issues here today, and laid a good platform for where we're going to go with that next session. So thanks so much for the time and the insights, and looking forward to our next conversation.
Thanks, Ken. Talk to you soon.
You bet.